So, Ollie, the first question in all of this is why Mark? And just looking at the history a little bit, in the patristic period, Mark's gospel was rather dismissed. I mean, Augustine said it's just an abridgment of Matthew, so it got sidelined liturgically, and as a consequence, it didn't very often get set to music, and that's continued really right up possibly to the last century.
Absolutely.
So given that history, why choose Mark? What is it?
Why Mark? Because it's the earliest, as we now think.
Yes.
And it was very important to me. It sort of always seems very important to me to try to sort of get back to as far as possible to the original source, to the kind of earliest writings about this, and so that's kind of why I wanted to go with Mark, because it's first, because it's short, and also because it's urgent. It moves at such a pace. Jesus is portrayed as a slightly impatient person, just who can't believe that people are still not getting it.
Yeah.
And that really, it sort of appealed to me. And the other part about it that I found very attractive is that, as far as we know, the original gospel text doesn't include the resurrection. That portion comes from a later source.
Yeah. Yeah.
It seemed to me perfect because, of course, the Passion story doesn't, in fact, end with the resurrection. It ends, as we will come on to, on the edge of resurrection, and so does this gospel narrative of it here.
Yeah.
So it just seemed, in all sorts of ways, to be really attractive for me, and that I thought it would really work well. And also in all of that, exactly as you already alluded to, there aren't very many settings of it.
No, that urgency does absolutely come across, which I like. In the Passion itself, there's the count of the days and even the count of the hours. It's sort of, it's got a propulsive momentum in the whole thing, without a doubt. Yeah. And it makes me wonder about the sort of audience that Mark was writing for. There are all sorts of theories about who he's writing for, but the one that seems to have the most likelihood seems to be writing in Rome. Post the death of Peter. Mark is linked to Peter, post the death of Peter and Paul, to a Christian community that's just been suffering the persecution under Nero. They're blamed for the Great Fire in Rome. And so there's this atmosphere of faith being challenged by terrible fear, which gives a whole different light on the gospel and how you read it, and these passages around do not be afraid and have faith and so on. So that's the audience I think that Mark is writing for. Do you carry that over? I mean, is that carried over into?
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of the kind of early Christian community, under pressure, and looking for this kind of for something to comfort them, and it's very interesting in that context that the original text ends with the line, "For they were afraid."
Yeah, so that's that fear at the end is absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's very interesting that that there is a lot of "do not be afraid," but yet at the very end, the women who discover him at the tomb, they are afraid. And I think that that was very important for me, that kind of cliffhanger, what will happen next. Of course, slight spoiler alert, we do know.
Yeah.
But I think that giving kind of comfort to some of the characters that don't have a voice, for instance, the bleeding woman, who doesn't actually say anything in the gospel, to some extent, giving a voice to Judas, who doesn't have very much to say, and also the father of the possessed boy. I think these things are all about giving that sense of reassurance. All of these problems can be brought to Jesus, and people can be made whole.
There's an interesting contrast, isn't there? Because Mark doesn't idealize the disciples. I mean, they come across as not understanding, not getting it. And then you've got the woman with the hemorrhage who does get it.
Yes,
You know,
absolutely.
so in a way, so Mark is addressing people in doubt. You know,
Yeah.
and I just wonder whether, you know, again, is that something we as an audience are meant to identify with in what you're writing?
I think quite possibly so. I mean, when I have started to, when I started to write this, I kind of came at it from the point of view that this isn't actually a story about the divine.
Hmm.
The passion is entirely human in the events from, the arrival into Jerusalem to the death on the cross. He God doesn't feature. God is or God the Father doesn't feature, at least.
Hmm.
He's appealed to, but doesn't respond.
Hmm. No, that's
And
true. Mark strips all of that out, doesn't he? That's really one of the attractive
yeah,
features of it, is a very, very human reality that we're dealing with here, in the
absolutely.
Passion.
And I think that's the thing. It is a human story, and I think with a lot of pieces that I write that are on religious themes, obviously faith plays an enormous part in this. But I also want to try and provide a way in for people who don't have that thinking about the humanness of these characters who are witnessing just some of the most astonishing events that any human being has ever witnessed
Hmm.
in the whole of recorded history is just astounding, and seeing how they respond in that situation.
Hmm. Yeah,
And seeing, yeah,
it's part of the way in which Mark comes across authentically, precisely because he doesn't theologize. He doesn't, like Matthew, have eschatological events happening around the death. You know,
absolutely.
it's
Yes,
just,
no graves, and
no,
yeah,
no, exactly. But that doesn't take away from the value of the Christian message in this. On the contrary, it enhances it, makes it more authentic in so many ways.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And to go back to your first point as well, I think that is why I was drawn to it. It was the sort of straightforwardness of it.
Mm.
And whilst there are, the miracles from the wider gospel, which I think, obviously, if you're trying to convince somebody, in the first century of Jesus's power to be able
Mm.
to, save you, a few miracles are probably worth putting in. But actually, and we recognise that the miracles were very important to Mark and to what Mark was trying to do for his audience.
Yeah.
And of course, there are several of them which actually kind of fit very neatly with the passion narrative as well,
Mm.
which is why we decided to kind of put those in
Mm.
as little sort of vignettes
Yeah.
along the way.
While we're talking about the sort of first disciples, I just thought would pick up on the use of musical themes. The Maronite hymn, for example, I I actually recognised it when we first sung it, because there is
Yeah,
there's a Catholic hymn which is not sung very much these days, but I can remember singing it as a child, which is a very mournful, plea for mercy, and don't put
yeah.
us all in hell kind of a thing, which is why it's not so popular these days. But but it's a lovely connection to have. But what was the intention around that? And are there more themes that come through than just that one? Have you just developed that, or have you picked up on other things as well?
No, so I mean, there are a few things, musical sort of themes in here, but yeah, you're absolutely right. That's the main one, and this is a tune that I first became aware of probably about 20 years ago or so,
Mm.
and it is apparently sung on the Via Dolorosa
Mm.
in Jerusalem. And had a root sort of back into the sort of Maronite tradition, into the
Mm.
sort of Syriac tradition, perhaps. I absolutely chased my tail trying to find trying to find the end of the rainbow on this one, and including having a call with a professor from a Syrian university to try to I mean, which I think language got the better of us both, and but trying to find the source of this was it just didn't work, and it may well even have been that this was a tune which originated in the West and was implanted by missionaries into the church in the East. So it just sort of didn't work. But I did reconcile, and I did say in the preface, this makes it extremely difficult to trace its provenance, though the idea of a melody that belongs to no time and yet to all time, to no one and yet to everyone, is perhaps the most appropriate that could be associated with this extraordinary story. I think I sort of reconciled myself to that viewpoint. I was kind of looking to try to find, are there melodies that we still know today that Jesus himself would have heard, because they would have, because they might have been drawn out of the Jewish tradition in those early Christian traditions, and the answer is sort of nobody knows.
There's a lack of musical notation from that time, which means that we don't really know what the sound world was, do we?
No,
we can guess from some of the indirect accounts, but
But I just liked, slightly fancifully, especially given that this actually does have a specific Aramaic name, that somehow people at the heart of this story would have been in some way familiar with that melody itself.
Yeah.
And it would have meant something, perhaps something different, but it would have meant something to them in all of this.
Yeah.
So, So it was that. So that was quite important, and the way that I've sort of introduced it is kind of to do with the words.
Yes.
So there is a big reveal at the end where, in the tradition of the Root de Vol Bach's, lovely death lullaby, and that's when the melody makes its kind of full appearance at the end, as blind as a beggar at the gate, or cold as clay. And but at the beginning, as we're talking about seeds, and again, a kind of an image of Christ as a seed planted later to spring, it's just broken up, and so throughout the whole of this passion, there are just little fragments of it that emerge at sometimes a little bit more appreciable than at others, until it is kind of fully emerges right at the end.
Well, let's just talk a little bit about parables and seeds and tenets and so on. I mean, in effect, what you're doing, I mean, you've got the sequence of the narrative of the Passion, but you break it apart with these miracles and events from earlier in the Gospel and bring them in. And you've made that quite a central feature of the architecture of the whole piece.
Yes, absolutely. When I wrote my Magnificat, I decided that I was going to draw into it different texts from different traditions that all kind of speak to this story, and and I looked to the Quran as well. And when I started investigating whether actually there were any sort of Quranic sort of descriptions of the crucifixion of Jesus, the doors are very much closed on this one, and it is very, very important that whilst they do think he was an important prophet, when he died. That's it. Okay, so that there isn't a kind of multi-faith, aspect to this. This is very much where we divide. I think to some extent on this issue, which then started making me think, well, what can I otherwise bring in to try and support this narrative, and then realized, reading it through, that there are the parable of the sower can have the meaning that we've just talked about, and that the bleeding woman, the father of the possessed boy, all of these stories can really contribute to our understanding of who Jesus is and what is actually being achieved throughout this passion narrative.
Yeah, it's what I find interesting is that it's a very different thing that you've done from, say, what Bach does, which is put lots of reflective arias in, or chorales that sort of get the audience to accept their culpability, as it were.
Yes.
But these texts are extraneous, whereas you've largely stuck to the text from Mark's gospel itself, and so you're opening up the gospel, even the early parts of the gospel, by doing this, rather than just focusing on the audience reaction.
I'm just going to bring up my plan again for it. This is so I'll show you. This is the original plan, which I drew for how this was actually going to be structured. And I must say, it has actually changed since then. But the thing that it was really clear to me that I was going to use sandwich structures as well.
Yes.
It's just reminded me, kind of looking at this, as of course Mark does in his gospel.
Yes.
Where he sticks one parable inside another as a kind of framing narrative.
Yeah, no, it's an architecture that I think does work. I think the audience will be helped by having the text in front of them when we come to the performance, and I think that's that's important, so they can see how it fits together.
Yeah.
Let me pick up on the other kind of key parable, which is the wicked tenants, and
Yes.
how you've used that. So instead of going for the brutality of the crucifixion, you've used the parable, as it were, to communicate that. And yet in the music, the parable itself ends with a pretty dramatic tragedy at the end. So in one way, you avoid the depiction of the brutality, but the emotional content is still there. Why did you do it that way around?
I can't quite express why I didn't rather want to portray literally the crucifixion itself. I think partly because it's horrendous.
Yeah. I remember listening recently to Essenwald's Passion of Luke, and he kicks off the kind of crucifixion scene with the sound of the nails going in.
Yes.
The percussion hammering the nails in, with the cries of Jesus, and it's a very, very different feel from what you achieve, and you're kind of drawn into the bloodiness of it in a way that at that moment is striking. And whereas you want to focus much more on it seems to me, on the kind of inner life, the psychology of what's going on in the characters.
Well, I think that is right. I certainly don't think we need to have the kind of gruesome horror of the crucifixion. It's very, very difficult to bring that kind of thing off in a sort of, well, it's so distasteful that how can you bring that off in a tasteful way and have a literal depiction of crucifixion? It's so appalling that I just thought we don't need that. We can understand that. Which is why, Lucia and I have used the parable of the wicked tenants there, and then we also use the stilling of the storm.
Just, on this kind of theme about avoiding the sort of brutality, I mean, one of the interesting things is you use the Psalms quite a bit and put them into
Yes.
the voices of Judas and
Yeah.
Peter, for example.
Yes.
The notable omission is Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Is the reason for was that an intentional thing, or did it just not fit into what else you were doing?
I think that where we have used the Psalms, we tend to have drawn from the Psalms in order to fill in the parts of the narrative that we don't already have.
Mm.
And given that we already have a pretty full account of what Jesus may or may not have said, then I think that's probably why we didn't reach for that
Mm.
psalm, like Peter, for instance.
Mm.
Um, we didn't just want to kind of come up with something random that Peter, you know, might have. Although actually, Lucia does a very good job of reimagining that kind of that fireside conversation,
Yes, yes,
which is sort of quite harrowing, really.
yes, it is. Yes, I
Uh,
agree.
but yeah, we kind of wanted it still to have a biblical tone to it. You're absolutely right. I think it sort of just didn't jump out at us because we would have probably had Jesus saying those words, as of course it is implied on Maundy Thursday that Jesus does say, but of course, you know, he doesn't because that is written so far in advance.
Mm.
Um, but or so far before, rather, I should say. Um, but yeah, I think that's probably the reason why
Yeah,
we
yeah,
didn't go with those words.
yeah, yeah. Once you've decided not to depict the crucifixion or its gruesomeness directly, I mean, those are words that are said from the cross, in fact. So
Yes, yes, absolutely.
therefore, it's been in a sense reinterpreted through the parable. One of the just coming back to sort of Mark's stripped down version.
Mm,
So one of the things about depicting the passion in as a kind of in its humanness is that he's trying to show that um, divine power is actually revealed in suffering. It doesn't display suffering; it's revealed in suffering, and so there's a message for us. It's escaping suffering isn't the answer. We actually have to, in some sense, enter it fully. Now that's not an easy thing to explain, but that's what Mark is seeming to convey. Do you think you've picked up on that? This idea of suffering comes through in more than just Jesus himself. I mean, you've got the hemorrhaging woman and the father of the possessed son. I mean, these are people who have suffered.
absolutely. And I think that's why we wanted to draw those people in as well. There is a sense in which they are both sort of used in this passion as trial witnesses. There is an enormous amount of suffering that has gone on by both of those characters. And in each case, Jesus intervenes to relieve their suffering. But it's very important. It's very important that there is, this undercurrent of suffering which is going on. The character of Barabbas, whom we haven't really spoken about, it was very obvious to us that Barabbas needed to be a real baddie. And it is obvious from the words that he says that he has inflicted enormous suffering.
Yeah.
It was very, very difficult to write that, after
Mm.
Lucia had sort of synthesized Jacobean tragedies and the words of death row murderers to to come up with this sort of extraordinarily
Sadistic, really, isn't it?
sadistic and
Yeah.
cold
Yes, yes.
account that Barabbas gives of himself and of his present
Mhm.
situation and of what he thinks, about other people's suffering. And I think as an audience, we're meant to, the whole point of it being so horrid is that we're meant to feel that very viscerally. We're meant to feel that suffering and that injustice.
Mhm.
very viscerally and be revulsed by it. And there we're kind of using, or it's the suffering that is causing, which is actually propelling us towards this other character,
Yeah,
Jesus.
yeah. No, it makes the striking contrast between them, as you know, it's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Just coming back to the other side of grief and suffering for a moment, it seems to me that music has the capacity to carry compassion and grief more readily than just words. That it kind of can minister to pain in some ways. Do you think this passion setting is capable of doing that? I mean, having resonances with people, with audience people that actually, you know, there's something about the total involvement of an audience member in a live performance you don't get listening to a recording, you don't get in a piece of art, you know, painting or something like that. There's an involvement there which creates a resonance that can actually minister to suffering, if I can put it like that.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that whilst there are parts of this that do make people feel uncomfortable, you know, I have, you know, had, you know, a lengthy discussion after after a particular performance with one audience member who struggled to understand that portion of it, and why he dramatically had to say the things that he said. And he, you know, and he has to say these things because we have to understand that he is not a nice person, and yet he is set free.
Are you talking about
But
Barabbas now?
so
Yeah.
we have to understand, you know, that
Mm.
he is not a nice person. No, I mean, actually, you know, Judas, you know, I think to be honest, we sort of set him up as the fall guy, knowing that, you know, he basically had to do what he had to do.
Mm.
There's a slight nod to that as well, in the sense that he's the kind of anti-hero of the piece, that,
Mm.
you know, because without him it wouldn't happen.
No, no. No,
In a
he's part of
sense.
the divine plan in some kind of strange way. That's right.
Yeah, in
Absolutely.
some
Yeah,
sort
yeah.
of strange way,
Strange way.
which is
Yeah.
why Judas in my setting is basically a baritone for most of the time, but
Mm.
and in the very last moment that he sings, he shoots right up to a top B. You know, tenors are often given the kind of heroic roles in
Mm.
operas and kind of musical drama like this. So it's a real sudden surprise when he just shoots up to this top B, having basically been a baritone for most of it, and it just changes our perception of him just ever so slightly in that moment.
Mm.
Because I didn't want to paint him as you know, as a total baddie in this, because I think that he's just a man in a really difficult position, as a lot of the human beings in this story find themselves. And I think, you know, just going, before I just carry on to answer this question, just going back to your last, I think there is a sense that people, people have difficult times in life. And I don't think there is any. I don't want to draw a sort of distinction between sort of biblical suffering and sort of
Mm.
everyday,
Mm.
suffering. All can relate with, you know, medical problems, with mental illness or psychological problems. You know, being in a difficult position because you're sort of being bribed to do something you don't really want to do or regret. You know,
Yes.
I think all of
Yes.
these things are very, very normal things that we all live with, and these are all painful. All of these people in this gospel narrative suffering pain, and it isn't just pain on a cross. You know, they're all suffering pains of their own, pains of their own ordinary lives,
Mm.
pains of loss after the death of their friend.
Yeah.
And then to come on to your question about the music and the ministry, I've very much viewed this third movement as though we're kind of in a meditative service. The music is kind of pulsating, and we have these 14 phrases, well, 13 plus "he is not here," um, perhaps the most important one. And I viewed this last bit as almost as like a service of
Mm.
Tenebrae. You know, growing up, I developed an enormous affinity with the music of Taizé and the church tradition of Taizé. That kind of losing yourself in music is a very good way to encounter the divine. I certainly think it's
Mm.
one of those moments where the distinction between heaven and earth is at its thinnest.
Yeah, it's shown in the kind of all the urgency and all the tempo and all the strong rhythmic sort of propulsion comes to an end at that point, doesn't it? I mean, you feel
Yes,
that in the music. It's quite a contrast for the singers, never mind for the audience, in what we're
yes.
trying to do at that point.
And in the original conception of this, all of the singers, all of the soloists, and some of the semi-chorus are actually standing around the audience, or at the very least, they are in the audience, as though they are the audience, you know,
Yes.
as though the audience are them, and
Mm.
everybody is participating in this. And so you get to hear, you know, a few of those little lines. There are others that you can't quite hear what, you know, somebody is saying, but everything is just sort of floating around, and everybody is sort of incorporate uh, in almost, you know, in an act of worship, certainly in a kind of vigil, you know, which is what's going on at you know, in part three,
Yeah.
you know, very much towards the end, before we kind of have that big reveal of the tune that has been being alluded to all the time as the choir enter with "Cold as Clay" and "Silent as Rock."
Yeah.
So, you know, I do think that music has an amazing ability to bring heaven and earth close to each other.
Mm. Just
Um,
it makes me pick up a bit on something that's what we were talking about earlier with the sort of the inner life of the characters. You know, I mean, you've
yes,
made some very conscious choices, I think, in this. It does, as you say, build on what Mark himself does, because what's interesting about the hemorrhaging woman is just how much detail Mark himself gives
yes.
about her. I mean, it's not you're not actually reading into
No,
that.
no, no.
It's quite clear. You know, you get a medical history, you get a real sense of her
Yes,
suffering, and that
yes,
what she comes with.
absolutely. And the first, you know, section of that, the, you know, perhaps, you know, what you might call the recit. There was a woman suffering of bleeding for 12 years, and she had suffered many things of the doctors.
Mm.
You know, it was very important, I think, to us that all of these characters were believable, and that they did have their own lives, and they
Mm.
did have their own um, concerns, and, you know, their own difficulties and their own joys, and these were things to be, you know, comforted or celebrated, or whatever it was.
You kind
Go
of
on, sorry.
transfer that to some of the other characters. And the one that interests me, perhaps again thinking about the original audience or readership of Mark's Gospel, is Peter, you know, and what
Yes,
happens to Peter, because for you know the Christian community facing persecution, here's Peter who's actually failed, um, and
yeah,
yet is redeemed in that context, because he finishes up as first pope and all that.
yes, absolutely. And we thought that it was very important that actually he's not left.
Mm.
um you know, that isn't the end of his story. So
No.
what's he thinking, and how do we continue his thought process? You
Yeah.
know, how do we live that a little bit more
Yeah.
uh with him? And, you know, and his first, you know, reaction is to, you know, is to chastise himself, but then it turns into, you know, hide me under the shadow of thy wing, you know, set me upon the rock which is higher than me. You know, obviously appropriate for Peter.
Yeah.
uh, and how he sort of moves past, you know, the you know, what he has done and his remorse for
Mm.
it,
Yeah.
to kind of seeking forgiveness for what he's done. And I think that, you know, it comes back to that idea of ordinary people having having real emotions and trying to work through difficult circumstances
Yeah.
in their own ways. You know, the way that Judas, um, thinks of himself, better I had not been born, which is sort of heartbreaking, really, because actually, if he hadn't been born, it would have been somebody else.
Yeah.
or, so I think there is a real sort of, in a way, with Judas, there is a kind of, properly Hegelian tragedy of two irreconcilable things that kind of meet together. Sorry, just
Sorry,
go
go
back
ahead.
to the bleeding woman, because
Yes.
um, there is a sense with the father of the possessed boy, with the bleeding woman. I actually think that the miracle somewhere in this is that Jesus takes her by the hand,
Mm.
because I think there is a reading of this entire passion narrative, even sort of with the miracles in there, that there doesn't have to be a divine reading necessarily. That Jesus doesn't need to have actually physically cured her of her, well, presumably endometriosis. Um, Jesus has cured her by making her clean, and making her acceptable to society again, from
Mm.
which she must have been, regarded as ritually unclean and as a sort of slight social pariah. By taking her seriously, hearing what she has to say, and taking her by the hand.
Mm.
And I think that in that society, that's, as much of a miracle. That's a bit, even more powerful in a way, because it properly interacts with the pain and the difficulty of the situation, and acknowledges it and works with it, rather than, just, well, there we are,
Yeah.
that was easy, wasn't it?
Yeah.
In
But
a sort of
it
way.
comes back to this Markan idea that the divine interventional power, however what you want to call it, is through the human reality,
Yes,
not in
absolutely.
spite of the human reality.
Yes,
It's through
absolutely.
the human reality,
Yeah,
that the miracle happens through that. I mean, if
quite.
and that's the power of the gospel.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think that, that was really, really important.
Let's come back to then the end and the edge of
Yeah.
resurrection. We've got Jesus laying in the tomb. We have this beautiful bit of poetry, cold as clay, and Jesus is waiting for a miracle. And you have the tenebrae candles and the 14 phrases
Yeah.
reflecting those being extinguished almost one at a time until you're just left
Yeah.
with Jesus is not here. We're right there on the edge of the resurrection. What are you looking for from the audience at that point?
So when I wrote this last section, I really wanted them to try and suspend their disbelief, suspend their prior knowledge of what it is that is coming, and try and just feel that sense of fear, excitement, anticipation, the sense that something is about to happen, but we don't quite know what yet. Because
Mm.
that is, that's how it ends. And they
Yeah,
trembled and fled and told no one.
yeah.
But of course, we
I'm
do know that they told somebody, because, you know,
yeah. We have
but
a
it's
gospel.
just, yeah, because we have a gospel. But just those last words, presumably by Jesus, he's gone to Galilee as he told you.
Yeah.
And I just want to leave us on the edge of this story. You know, we all know kind of what's going to go on, but we're just on the cusp here of an event which is going to change the course of history,
Mm.
and which is why I sort of really wanted to just leave it at that point
Mm.
and hold people in that moment.
There's a one of the things that happens through various events is the shift always from fear, real fear, to the
Yeah.
kind of fear that is an awe, fear and awe. So
Yes. Yeah.
with the healing, there's sort of the being afraid shifts into something quite different each time.
Yes.
And that kind of resonated with me at that point of standing on the edge. And so there's lots of echoes come back at that point when you sort of, you're at the end and you're picking up things. And the other thing that comes back to me at that point is, will you hear? Because it takes
Yes.
us right back to the parable of the sower at the beginning. Will you
Yeah.
hear? So will you hear everything that's gone before to get us to this moment?
Yes. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, one of the other reasons for leaving it at this point and why it was sort of so attractive is it was written for a performance on Good Friday, at St. Delian. So there is a sense in which I couldn't spoil, you know,
Yes.
there were no spoilers. So the crucifixion is actually depicted. I should say that.
Yes.
But it's depicted instrumentally. So the moment of the crucifixion happens at the beginning of part 3.
Yeah.
So they divided up his clothes and they diced them, and it was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him. And then what follows? The chaos of the crucifixion. And then we go into there rose up a great storm of wind.
Yeah.
So it's almost as though that is carrying on in the background. The camera angle pans away, and we just follow a different track for a moment.
It's quite a complex metaphor, actually. The stilling of the storm. There's quite a few ways of reading it, in fact. But you've got the storm, Jesus sleeping.
Yes.
Is this his already dead, as it were? And then coming into the haven and the calming. Again, it's alluding to the resurrection already. I mean, that's
exactly.
That.
And that was really what we were trying to do here. That we're just trying to take a step back from what was actually happening to his body, and just sort of think about what was actually happening on a broader level. And that is, and it works so beautifully to have this, to have Jesus asleep, literally asleep in this, whilst the turbulence kind of spins around him. But we don't need to see that turbulence spinning, because we've heard a bit of it already. And we're just sort of taking a step back from it now. The thing that I also really liked was how the roles get reversed. That in the Garden of Gethsemane, it's the disciples who are sleeping, and Jesus saying, "Could you not watch, for 1 hour?" And then here, after the crucifixion, we have those roles reversed, that Jesus is sleeping, and presumably the disciples are, at least in some ways, trying to wake him. And of course it's coming. So once we sort of settled upon using that, it just seemed to be a really good way of just stepping away from what we know is going on towards what's really going on here. And it links very nicely with the idea of the seed that was planted in the earth at the very beginning, that there is some sort of deep level thing which is sort of happening throughout the course of this. And then there are sort of surface details which are also going on. But there is a kind of fundamental process at work as well.
Coming back then to that kind of the final phrase of "he is not here." One of the things that it says to me is, he's not here. You need to look for the resurrection elsewhere, and that then pulls you back to the, if it were in a liturgical context, you'd be saying, the community around you. This is where he now is. It's a sort of shifting. It comes back to the shifting of perspective. It's away from, this is no longer the reality of Jesus and Christ. It's now been transformed into something quite different.
Well, exactly that, and I think that the "he is not here" part, you are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He is not here. Because actually there is now somebody else. But tantalizingly, I did decide to have the last three "he is not here's" actually spoken by Jesus himself.
Yes, yes,
Um,
yes.
but the fact is that he obviously isn't there in some ways because they don't recognize him. So there is obviously some sort of, and I don't want to use the word transfiguration, incorrectly, but there is obviously, some transmutation, in some way, because simply because they don't recognize him, and he is in a sense a different person, but it's a kind of dot 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 moment. Yes, I think, after the last "he is not here" in here, I did put an ellipsis, um I suppose, which is to say, well, he is not here, but you'll never guess what.